A man just returned to his peaceful family lake after burning out from Silicon Valley, ready to heal, to breathe again. But the HOA slapped him with a violation notice demanding he remove his grandfather's old fishing boat within 48 hours. What they didn't know. He owned the lake. 7 days later, he shut down their elite fishing tournament, got the HOA president investigated for fraud, and turned the lake into a protected sanctuary. This is one of the most satisfying stories of standing your ground and exposing lies at the highest level. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up to petty authority, you're not alone. Now let me take you to the beginning. It was just an ordinary sunrise. The kind that paints the water in shades of orange and gold. The kind that you don't just see but feel. Jake Sullivan sat on the weathered porch of his grandfather's lakeside cabin, a mug of black coffee warming his calloused hands, steam rising like mist ghosts into the crisp spring air. The silence around him wasn't empty, it was full of memory. Every creak of the wooden boards beneath his feet, every call of a mourning dove in the trees, brought echoes of summers long past fishing trips with Grandpa at dawn, splashing in the water until dusk. And stories told under a sky littered with stars so bright they didn't feel real. Just 6 months earlier, Jake's life looked nothing like this. For over a decade, he'd been grinding through the chaos of Silicon Valley, building a cybersecurity startup from scratch. The stress was brutal pitch meetings, investor pressure, sleepless nights, debugging code, months of 16-hour days, and then came the offer. A major conglomerate wanted to buy his company. The number on that check, more zeros than he ever thought he'd see. It was enough to walk away. But when the wires cleared and the champagne flutes were empty, Jake didn't feel triumphant. He felt hollow. He'd given everything his 20s, his health, his relationships to build something that now belonged to someone else. So he did what many dream of, but few dare. He disappeared. No social media posts. No dramatic farewell. He packed up, left the Bay Area, and drove east, back to a place he hadn't seen in almost 5 years, Sullivan Lake. The lake had been in his family for generations. His grandfather, a commercial fisherman turned conservationist, had bought the entire 50-acre lake and the surrounding woodland in the 1950s. Back when land was cheap and the world was quieter, he'd built the cabin by hand with timber from the surrounding trees and had spent his final years teaching local kids how to fish and respect the water. Jake had worshipped the man. To him, Grandpa wasn't just a relative, he was a compass, a man who stood for something. Jake's father had inherited the property but never really used it. A city man through and through. He preferred airports to dirt roads and hotel lobbies to muddy shores. When both his grandfather and father passed within 2 years of each other, Jake had been too busy with product launches and board meetings to even consider what that meant. But now, with nothing holding him back, Sullivan Lake called like a forgotten lullaby. He arrived in early March, when the trees were still bare and the lake surface shimmered with the cold memory of winter. The cabin was in decent shape, thanks to a local caretaker. But Jake threw himself into restoring it with a kind of focus he hadn't felt in years. New plumbing, solar panels on the roof, a satellite dish for internet, but he kept the soul intact, rough-hewn beams, the stone fireplace, the hooks on the wall where Grandpa used to hang his tackle box. Each day melted into the next in the best way possible. Morning coffee by the water, afternoon repairs or nature walks, evenings spent in his grandfather's old aluminum fishing boat, floating quietly in the center of the lake as the sun dipped below the tree line. There was no noise, no emails, no performance reviews or Q4 forecasts, just frogs, dragonflies, and the occasional ripple of a fish breaking the surface. Jake had begun to think he'd found peace. But peace, as it turns out, is sometimes just the calm before someone else's storm. It was a Tuesday morning when the first crack appeared. He'd just walked down to the dock, coffee in hand, when he saw something fluorescent and ugly taped to the side of his boat. Neon orange, bold black letters, a violation notice. His first reaction was confusion. Then came disbelief. And finally, amusement so sharp it cut through the quiet like glass. According to the letter, Jake was in breach of Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association visual standards and had 48 hours to remove the unauthorized watercraft from community waters. Failure to comply would result in a $500 per day fine and possible impoundment. Jake blinked. Community waters. He turned the letter over in his hands, half expecting a joke or a hidden camera, but it was all there legalese. Signatures, and an HOA letterhead complete with a gold crest. His smile faded as the absurdity calcified into insult. Sullivan Lake wasn't community property. It wasn't part of any subdivision or HOA. It was private land, his private land, down to every cattail on the shoreline and every fish beneath the surface. This wasn't a neighborhood retention pond. This was a family legacy, a sacred place, and someone had the gall to treat him like a trespasser on his own land. Jake stormed back up the path toward the cabin, adrenaline beginning to surge. On the way, he passed the weathered sign his grandfather had carved decades ago, Sullivan Lake, private property. Respect the water. He stared at it, the memory of Grandpa's voice echoing in his ears. Water is life, Jake, not just for fish, for all of us. You protect it, no matter what, in the mailbox. He found the official letter, same content, but this one was signed by a man named Richard Wilkins, president of the Maple Creek Estates HOA. Jake had never heard of him. He'd barely had time to sit down and process the letter when his phone rang. It was Rye Delgado, his closest neighbor. Rye was 74, a retired carpenter who lived a quarter-mile down the shore, weathered skin, a voice like gravel, and hands that told stories all on their own. Rye had known Jake's grandfather and had welcomed Jake back with quiet kindness in a jar of homemade peach preserves. Morning. Jake. Rye said, I see the vultures found you. Jake exhaled. You've dealt with this before, yep. They tried to say my boat shed was unsightly a few years back. Told them where they could shove their notice and haven't heard since. But you're the Sullivan kid. They've been using your lake for years like it's theirs. Tournaments, picnics, fancy fishing clubs, all without asking. Jake was silent. I know your grandfather would have run him off with a shotgun full of rock salt, Rye added, and in that moment, Jake felt something inside shift. This wasn't about a boat anymore. This was about theft, about someone taking your heritage, your name, your peace, and wrapping it in bureaucracy. This was about power dressed up as process, and they picked the wrong man. What would you do if someone tried to take what's rightfully yours, your home, your legacy, your peace, and fine you for standing on your own ground? Because that's exactly what Jake Sullivan was about to face. And what he did next, it would set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. Jake didn't sleep much that night. The violation notice sat on his kitchen table like a radioactive threat, glowing orange under the soft pendant light above. He'd read it a dozen times, each pass only deepening the mixture of fury and disbelief tightening in his chest. The absurdity of it, the sheer gall kept playing over in his mind like a broken tape. They were threatening him, on his own land. He spent the evening digging through a weathered filing cabinet he'd only half organized since moving in. It was tucked away in the corner of the cabin, behind an old wool coat of his grandfather's in a box labeled tackle. Do not throw. The documents inside were dusty but orderly. His father may not have cared much for the lake, but he'd kept the records clean. Deeds, surveys, title transfers. Everything Jake needed to confirm what he already knew. He owned the lake, every muddy inch of shoreline and every drop of water within it. But it wasn't enough to know, not anymore. He needed to prove, to document, to prepare, because this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding he could clear up with a phone call or a neighborly conversation over coffee. No, this was the beginning of a fight. The next morning, Jake drove to the nearest town with cell reception and made 2 calls. The first was to a hardware store to purchase high-definition security cameras. The second was to a woman he hadn't spoken to in nearly 4 months. Emma. He said as soon as she picked up, I need your help. Emma Porter was many things a brilliant environmental lawyer. Jake's former college roommate, and one of the few people in his life who understood why he'd walked away from a multi-million-dollar company to live by a lake. She listened silently as Jake explained the situation the HOA's notice, the claim that the lake was community property, and Rye's warning about tournaments and trespassing. "They've been using your land for organized events," she asked sharply, "without permission. For years, apparently, and they're trying to restrict you from accessing your own boat." Jake could hear the growing edge of indignation in her voice. "Exactly." There was a pause. "Jake," she said slowly, "this is gold." "Gold," she chuckled. "In legal terms, if everything you're saying is true, and I don't doubt it, we have them. Trespassing, misrepresentation, potential fraud if they've been charging fees under false pretenses. I'll drive up this weekend. Don't respond to their letter. Don't remove the boat. Just start gathering evidence. We'll bury them in facts." Jake hung up, feeling a rare sense of clarity. The fog of outrage had lifted, replaced by a cold, focused determination. By noon, he was back at the lake. Camera gear spread across his dock. He installed 3 units that day, one overlooking the shore where most of the boats launched, one at the eastern side of the lake where Rye said the tournaments happened, and one hidden in the brush near the walking trail that crossed the southern edge of his property. Each camera was discreet, high-res, motion-activated, and connected to his phone through a secure app. By that night, he already had footage of 2 teenagers fishing from his dock and a woman walking her dog along the lake's edge like it was a public park. It wasn't personal, not yet. These people probably didn't know any better. That's what made it worse. Sullivan Lake had become something else while it sat unoccupied. It had been absorbed by assumption, by convenience, by an HOA with an agenda, and Jake, he had become a problem. That evening, after tightening the last camera bolt, he took the boat out again. It was a calm night, stars pushing their way through the indigo sky. He drifted to the center of the lake, shut off the motor, and let the silence wrap around him. He thought about his grandfather, about the stories, the laughter, the strict reverence for nature that had shaped Jake's childhood. He could still hear the old man's voice, gruff, wise, unshakable. "They'll take everything if you let them, Jake. Not because they need it, but because they think they can." The wind was cool on his face. Jake clenched the sides of the boat, not in anger, but in resolve. He wasn't letting them take it. Not 1 inch, not 1 drop of water. 3 days later, the email arrived. It wasn't a personal message, it was a mass invitation. A copy-paste job sent to the entire Maple Creek Estates mailing list. Subject line, upcoming community HOA meeting. Attendance encouraged. Jake almost deleted it. Then he reconsidered. He'd never been to one of these meetings. He didn't even realize the HOA held gatherings open to residents beyond the official subdivision. But if they were bold enough to regulate his boat, then they were bold enough to talk like they owned the whole damn lake. So he decided to go. He didn't dress up, didn't rehearse, just showed up early, in his boots and flannel, notebook tucked under one arm. The meeting was held in the Maple Creek Estates Community Center, a building so out of place in the rural landscape, it looked like it had been helicoptered in from a country club. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, a fountain out front shaped like a fish. Inside, about 30 residents sat scattered across rows of neatly arranged folding chairs. The atmosphere was half boredom, half suppressed irritation. Jake chose a seat in the back row and observed. Then the man himself appeared. Richard Wilkins. If someone had designed a cliché of a suburban power tripper, it would have been him, polished gray hair, navy blazer, gold-plated HOA pin. He took the podium like it was a throne and opened the meeting with the monotone roll call of lawn violations and mailbox design approvals. Jake sat still, listening, waiting. Finally, Wilkins turned the subject to the lake. "We've had reports," he announced, "of an unregistered vessel being stored on community waters. As a reminder, all boats must adhere to HOA guidelines and be appropriately registered. The lake is one of our most valuable community features and must remain aesthetically aligned with our vision." Jake raised his hand, heads turned, A few eyebrows lifted. Wilkins looked surprised. Yes, a gentleman in the back, Jake stood. I was wondering, when you say community waters, what exactly do you mean? Who owns the lake? A hush fell over the room. A few people exchanged glances. Wilkins' smile didn't move. The lake is part of the Maple Creek Estates managed zone. It's been that way for years. But do you own it? Jake asked. Or is that an assumption based on proximity? Wilkins' fingers tightened slightly on the podium. There are historical arrangements in place. That's all I can say at this time. Jake nodded slowly, then sat back down. He didn't need to press further. The seeds had been planted. After the meeting, as people gathered their things, Jake felt eyes on him. A man approached seas, sun-weathered skin, expensive fishing vest, confident, rehearsed smile, Gerald Thompson. He said, president of the Elite Anglers Club. Jake introduced himself. Gerald blinked. Sullivan, the cabin on the North Shore. That's right. My grandfather bought the lake in the 50s. Ah, of course. We always wondered who owned that place. He laughed like it was a compliment. We assumed it had been abandoned. Jake gave a polite smile. It wasn't, just underutilized. Gerald leaned in slightly. You should join us this Saturday. Big tournament. Biggest of the year. Right on the East Shore. Jake accepted the invitation with a nod. Heart pounding for an entirely different reason. They just invited him to witness their trespassing firsthand. As he left the building, Jake overheard Wilkins whispering to Gerald and another woman. He slowed near the refreshment table, feigning interest in decaf coffee. Accelerate the timeline. Wilkins muttered, deal with the Sullivan issue before it's too late. Jake didn't move, didn't flinch, just quietly walked out, each step firmer than the last. The battle had begun, and this time, he wasn't building code, he was building a case. Jake's cabin was quiet when he returned from the HOA meeting, but his mind was anything but. He paced the living room floor, Emma's voice echoing in his head. Document everything. He had already installed the cameras, already confirmed the deed, but now, with Wilkins's veiled comment still ringing in his ears, accelerate the timeline. Deal with the Sullivan issue. The urgency shifted. It wasn't just about protecting his lake anymore. It was about uncovering what the HOA was trying to bury. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. If these people were planning something big, there had to be signs, permits, filings, public records. It didn't take long to stumble onto the Maple Creek Estates website. A glossy PR front for the subdivision. Jake scrolled past the expected fluff, family photos, guidelines for mailbox color schemes, holiday potluck announcements until he found a tab labeled Elite Anglers Club. He clicked. What stared back at him wasn't a neighborhood hobby group. It was a fully branded operation. High-res images of middle-aged men in matching polos, gripping oversized bass like trophies, smiling beside tents and catering setups. There were photos of boats launched from a freshly built dock on his eastern shoreline, the same shoreline where his grandfather once taught kids to skip stones. Jake's jaw clenched as he scrolled further. One post, dated just a week earlier, detailed the upcoming 15th annual championship tournament, proudly hosted on Sullivan Lake, $5,000 prize, catered BBQ, exclusive waters. The copy read, secured through HOA partnerships. He stared at those words, blinking slowly, a pressure building behind his eyes. Exclusive waters. His hands trembled slightly as he clicked through archives. They had been doing this, profiting off his land for years. Pictures from 5 summers ago showed a nearly identical setup. Each year, more elaborate, more corporate, logos, sponsors, even drone footage. And not once had anyone asked permission. No emails, no contracts, no acknowledgement that the lake wasn't theirs to begin with. Jake leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice again, low and furious. You don't ask permission to take from a man. You don't take from a man. That's how it started. First the dock, then the land, then your name. Jake needed help. He picked up his phone and texted Emma. They're hosting an illegal fishing tournament on my property this Saturday. 5-figure prize, full BBQ. I have proof, photos, website, event pages. We need a plan. Her reply came 2 minutes later. Don't stop digging. I'll bring county records when I drive up Friday. Let's expose every inch of this. Jake didn't sleep much that night. He moved to the couch around midnight, laptop still warm on his thighs, surrounded by a fortress of printouts and screenshots. He started organizing them by year, creating a timeline of how the HOA had slowly, methodically expanded its claim over the lake. He flagged each use of the phrase community waters, each instance where they'd claimed authority they didn't possess. By morning, a new folder sat on his desktop. Evidence, Sullivan Lake misuse. That afternoon, as if summoned by fate, Ry Delgado showed up. Jake was on the back deck, installing a solar motion light. When he heard Ry's truck crunching over gravel, the old man stepped out slowly, hat tilted low, his usual easy smile absent. "You got a minute?" Ry asked. Jake nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's up?" Pulled a folded piece of paper from his back pocket. "My niece works at the county planning office. She gave me this." Jake opened it. A preliminary development application. Maple Creek Estates was requesting permission to begin zoning analysis for commercial expansion, specifically a luxury lakeside resort with condominiums, a private marina, and a championship golf course. And right there, in bold, was the projected centerpiece of the project, Sullivan Lake. Jake stared at it. His hands went cold. "They're planning to build a resort," he said. Ry nodded grimly, "with your lake as the crown jewel." My niece said the application just came in quiet, almost under the radar, but it's there. And they've been grooming the board and neighbors for it 4 years. That's why they built up that fishing club, to make it seem like the HOA always had control. Jake felt as if the ground beneath him shifted. He leaned on the deck railing, breathing slow. This wasn't about aesthetics. This wasn't about boats. This was about money, about millions. And he had just stepped into the path of a juggernaut. Later that evening, Emma arrived. She brought a box of files with her county deeds, water rights case studies, and most importantly, a copy of the original Maple Creek Estates development plan from over a decade ago. Together, they spread everything out on the cabin's dining table, pushing aside Jake's fishing gear and a half-eaten sandwich. "Look here," Emma said, pointing to a paragraph in the developer's statement. "It clearly says Sullivan Lake lies outside the scope of Maple Creek Estates property and will not be included in managed recreational infrastructure." That's their own language. Jake exhaled in disbelief. "So they've been lying from day one?" Emma nodded. "Not just to you, to their residents. If they've been collecting HOA fees under the pretense that they manage the lake, we're potentially looking at fraud. That's criminal." They spent hours that night reviewing footage from Jake's new cameras. Already, the digital recording showed multiple HOA members launching kayaks from Jake's shoreline, erecting tents, even installing banners without consent. The digital timestamps gave the footage legal teeth. At one point, they paused on an image of Richard Wilkins, his polished loafers planted firmly on Jake's soil, giving a speech to a group of men in suits near the dock. Emma squinted at the image. "Those aren't HOA members. Investors," Jake asked. "Probably. They're pitching it already." "Without your consent." Emma leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Jake, this isn't just trespassing anymore. It's coordinated misrepresentation. If they're showing your lake as part of a real estate pitch without your ownership or agreement, that's actionable. In multiple ways." Jake's jaw tightened. "Good. Let's act." They began crafting a plan. Step 1, let the tournament happen. Let the HOA commit its final act of arrogance, all while being filmed from every angle. Step 2, file for an emergency injunction the following Monday, armed with deeds, footage, and the county records. Step 3, send a formal letter to the HOA, requesting full documentation of their supposed authority over the lake and CC every resident. By midnight, the plan was drafted, the documents were organized, and the emotional storm inside Jake had hardened into something steel-like. Not rage, Not even revenge. Justice. As Emma retired to the guest room and the house fell quiet, Jake stepped out onto the porch once more. The lake shimmered in moonlight, calm and oblivious. A family of ducks floated peacefully near the reeds. Somewhere across the water, a bullfrog croaked. Jake stood in silence for a long time, hands in his pockets, heart steady. He had always thought that escaping Silicon Valley would mean escaping the games, the deception, the politics. But here, deep in nature, someone was playing a different game, a quieter, more insidious one. And they didn't know that Jake Sullivan had spent a decade surviving boardrooms in billion-dollar negotiations. They didn't know he had built firewalls that protected banks from state-sponsored hackers. They thought he was just a guy with a rusty boat. They were wrong. Saturday was coming, and with it, the storm. The morning of the fishing tournament dawned with deceptive serenity. A veil of mist floated lazily over Sullivan Lake, catching the pink-orange light of early sunlight gauze. Birds sang in the trees. Frogs chirped along the marshy banks. And to any outsider looking in, it was a perfect spring Saturday calm, clean and harmless. But Jake Sullivan stood on his porch with binoculars in hand and tension in his spine. They were already arriving. Trucks and SUVs rolled up one by one along the eastern shoreline, his eastern shoreline carrying boats, barbecue equipment, fishing coolers, folding chairs, and tents. At least 20 vehicles in the first hour. Some were plastered with decals of local sponsors. Others had the now infamous Elite Anglers Club logo across their windows, a gold fish hook piercing the silhouette of a lake. Jake's cameras caught every second. Emma joined him on the porch shortly after 7. Saw him clutching a mug of black coffee in a manila folder thick with documents. "They're not even trying to hide it," she said, raising an eyebrow as one group erected a pop-up canopy directly over a marker Jake had driven into the ground 2 nights ago, clearly labeled private property. No trespassing. Jake didn't respond. His silence had changed. It wasn't brooding anymore. It was the measured, coiled quiet of someone waiting for the exact right moment to strike. He glanced at Emma. "You ready?" She smirked. "Always." They spent the morning documenting. Emma used a high-powered DSLR with a telephoto lens, while Jake monitored the live feeds from his motion-triggered cameras. From their vantage point halfway up the hill, they could see the fluid layout of the unauthorized event, a long line of boats launching from the makeshift dock, a buffet table loaded with catered food, and Gerald Thompson, the club president, schmoozing with new faces dressed too well to be locals. At 10:17, a silver BMW pulled up near the tournament entrance. Jake didn't need the binoculars. He knew the man before the door opened, Richard Wilkins. Except this time, he wasn't alone. 3 well-dressed individuals, 2 men and 1 woman, climbed out behind him, each carrying a portfolio. One wore aviator sunglasses. Another had a badge around his neck. The woman was clearly in charge. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the wooden dock as Wilkins trailed behind, gesturing toward different points along the shoreline. "That's them," Emma muttered. "Investors." They watched as Richard handed out glossy brochures, pointing at key locations like a salesman selling a dream. The woman flipped through the materials, nodded once, and pointed toward the southern ridge, the area Jake had once cleared with his grandfather to build a garden. Emma zoomed in, capturing every frame. "He's pitching them false control," she whispered. "He's actually showing them land he doesn't own. He's showing them my childhood." Jake said, voice low and hard, "By noon." The crowd had grown. Music blared from a Bluetooth speaker. Kids ran along the grass, tossing stones into the lake. A grill fired up. People laughed, ate, posed for pictures. Meanwhile, Jake stood unseen in the woods above, watching his land transformed into a party venue without permission. That's when he got the alert. The camera near his dock pinged him motion detected. He tapped to view. 2 men in HOA polos were standing at the end of his personal dock, one with a clipboard, the other holding a measuring tape. They appeared to be taking photos of his boat. Jake's pulse surged. "They're at my dock," he said aloud. Emma came over to look. "Are they trying to remove it again? I don't know, but we've got them." This is overreach, full-on trespassing. Again, Emma took her phone and began making calls. The first was to the local sheriff's department. The second was to the county courthouse. At 2:15 p.m., Judge Harmon granted an emergency injunction. It was swift, thorough, and crushingly effective. The motion recognized Jake Sullivan as the legal and sole owner of Sullivan Lake and its surrounding properties, declared all ongoing events unauthorized, and ordered the immediate cessation of all group activities on the property until further legal review. Jake held the official document in his hand, printed hot from Emma's portable cannon. The time had come. He changed into clean jeans and a black jacket, slid the folded injunction into a clipboard, and slipped the deed to Sullivan Lake in beside it. Emma loaded a bag with copies, press kits, and backup footage, and then called the security company Jake had retained earlier that week. They all met on the side of the road at 3 m. Jake, Emma, 2 uniformed security officers, and a sheriff's deputy assigned by the county. Jake took one last look at the water, and then he walked toward the crowd. At first, nobody noticed him. He passed by 2 teenagers tossing beanbags into a cornhole board, a group of women laughing over champagne and plastic flutes. And finally, Gerald Thompson, still in his tournament vest, clipboard in hand. Gerald turned just as Jake reached the announcer's table. "Jake," he said, startled, "didn't expect you to come down. You're just in time for, you need to stop everything." Jake interrupted, calm but commanding. "Right now." Gerald blinked. What Jake nodded to the deputy beside him. The officer stepped forward, raised his voice. "Everyone, may I have your attention?" The buzz of activity quieted. Heads turned. This tournament is being held on private property without authorization from the landowner. You are hereby instructed to vacate the premises immediately. This injunction, he raised the paper, was signed by County Judge Harmon and will be enforced by law. Murmurs turned into gasps. Someone dropped a plate. The music stopped mid-song. Gerald's face flushed red. "This is absurd. We've done this for 15 years. Emma stepped forward now, calm as ever, and not once with permission. "Mr. Sullivan owns the lake, the water, the shore. You've trespassed, profited, and misled dozens of people into thinking this was legal." Richard Wilkins pushed through the crowd, eyes burning with disbelief. "This is a misunderstanding." Emma cut him off. "No, Mr. Wilkins. The misunderstanding is thinking no one would notice, that no one would return, that you could steal a legacy and no one would challenge you. But he's here now." She pointed to Jake. Richard's voice wavered. We've been managing this lake for years. The HOA, you've pretended to manage it," Emma said coldly, "while promoting false information to investors, while collecting fees for access you never had rights to grant." From behind the crowd, the woman investor stepped forward, eyes narrow. "Is this true?" she asked Wilkins, holding up the brochure. "You said you controlled this property." Richard stammered. "There were arrangements." "No," Jake said firmly, stepping into the center. "There were lies, and I have every document to prove it." There was a long, hanging silence, then chaos. Some people shouted, others packed their gear. A man cursed and threw his fishing pole to the ground. 2 women began yelling at Gerald, demanding refunds for club dues. The sheriff's deputy began guiding people back to their vehicles, warning of citations if they refused. Richard Wilkins stared at Jake, face white with rage. "You have no idea what you've just done." Jake smiled coldly. "Actually, I know exactly what I've done. I've taken back what's mine. By 4 p.m., the shoreline was clear, tents folded, docks dismantled. The investors drove off without shaking hands. The banner for the Elite Anglers Championship sagged sadly across the now empty lawn. Jake stood beside Emma as the last car pulled away. She exhaled deeply. "You did it." He nodded slowly. "Not yet, but today was a turning point." She looked out over the water. What now? Jake turned toward the trees, where his grandfather once carved the trail with a hand axe in a dream. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the old photograph of the cabin's construction, The one with Grandpa smiling in front of a newly placed beam and held it gently. Now, he said, now we build something that lasts. The air in Jake's cabin buzzed with a different kind of electricity the morning after the tournament shutdown. The night before had ended in exhausted silence. Both he and Emma, too, drained to speak much as they watched the last of the trespassers retreat down the dirt road. But now, daylight poured through the windows and bathed the table in gold, and every square inch of that table was covered in paperwork. Court documents, photographs, maps, and signed affidavits. Jake stood with a coffee mug in one hand, staring down at the wreckage of a lie that had stretched years and generations. He didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. It was too soon. Too much still remained hidden beneath the surface. The HOA's arrogance wasn't born out of thin air. It had been built on something: networks, funding, quiet permissions, and he needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. Emma shuffled into the room in a loose sweatshirt, rubbing sleep from her eyes and pulling her hair back into a ponytail. She barely looked at him before grabbing her own cup and muttering, "Wilkins is going to come back. You know that." "Right," Jake nodded. "He won't be able to help himself." Emma flipped open a laptop and booted it up. "We need to go on offense." The court injunction was good, very good, but it won't last forever. If they regroup legally or financially, we'll be right back here. We have to finish this. Discredit the whole operation. Jake leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "So where do we start?" Emma looked up. "With money, every fraud leaves fingerprints. Let's follow the cash." They spent the next several hours diving into public financial records for Maple Creek Estates. The HOA was a nonprofit entity, meaning it had to file annual disclosures. Most were basic expense reports, vague line items about landscaping and community services. But Emma had an eye for irregularities. She started highlighting. "Look at this," she said, turning the screen toward Jake. "Starting 5 years ago, right when the Elite Anglers Club started blowing up, there's a spike in recreational facility maintenance expenses, almost triple from the year before." Jake frowned. "But they don't maintain any public facilities near the lake. That's all private land." Emma nodded. "Exactly. So where's that money going?" They cross-referenced that data with HOA meeting minutes, some of which had been posted online, in one from 3 years prior. There was a brief mention of upgrades to dock areas and temporary event structures for lakefront use. The budget allocated nearly $38,000. Jake stared at the line. They were using HOA farm funds to build infrastructure on land they didn't own, which means, Emma added, they were collecting dues from every resident in that community, under false pretenses. That's civil fraud, maybe criminal, if we can tie it to intent. They spent hours mapping connections, building a web of documentation that all pointed to one core truth the HOA had fabricated: authority it didn't possess, and had spent real money, other people's money, to build and promote events on land they neither leased nor owned. By early afternoon, the sound of tires crunching gravel snapped Jake's attention to the front of the house. A familiar pickup truck. Ry Delgado stepped out, waving an envelope in one hand. "Mail carrier dropped this at my place by mistake. Thought you might want it." Jake thanked him, took the envelope, and frowned at the return address, a law firm in town, not Emma's. He opened it and scanned the contents quickly. Emma leaned over. "What is it?" Jake held it up. "A formal letter from the HOA's attorney, reasserting their demand that I cease interference with HOA operations and threatening legal action if I continue obstructing community access." Emma laughed out loud, nearly spilling her coffee. "They're bluffing. That's desperation talking. They're trying to make it sound like I'm the problem," Jake said quietly. Ry, who had remained respectfully silent until now, cleared his throat. "You know who you should talk to, Sarah Lynn, reporter for the Red Valley Chronicle. She did a piece last year on an HOA that got caught laundering landscaping funds. Blew it wide open. You get her involved. This thing will catch fire." Emma perked up. "That's not a bad idea." Jake hesitated. "Wouldn't that make everything public too fast?" Emma shook her head. "We want pressure. If you corner Wilkins in court, he'll stall, counterfile, delay. But if he's facing angry residents, bad press, and possibly law enforcement. That's a very different kind of fire. By 5 p.m., they were seated at a small cafe in town across from Sarah Lynn. She was younger than Jake expected, early 30s. Sharp blazer, even sharper eyes that didn't miss a single movement. She listened as Jake and Emma laid out the situation, nodding occasionally, taking notes in a weathered leather-bound notebook. When they were done, she asked only one question. "Do you have proof?" Jake slid the folder across the table. "Everything." She flipped through it for nearly 10 minutes in silence. Then she looked up. "I'll need to verify independently," she said. "But if this holds, it's one of the most brazen cases of HOA overreach I've seen. And I've seen some doozies," Emma added. "They're planning to build a resort. We have the preliminary application. They pitched investors during the tournament." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "And those investors thought they owned the lake. Wilkins told them he was in negotiations with me," Jake said bitterly. Sarah looked at them both, then leaned back slowly. "This is big. Like, front page regional press, big." Jake looked out the window, hands clenched. "You sure you want to go through with this?" she asked him directly. Jake nodded. "They tried to erase my grandfather's legacy. They stole my land and paraded it like a trophy. I want it all on record." Sarah smiled faintly. "In that case, I'll get to work." The next day, things moved quickly. Emma filed a formal complaint with the county attorney's office, attaching the injunction, video footage, and financial discrepancies. Meanwhile, Sarah published a teaser article online, a brief headline about Sullivan Lake ownership dispute that included a photo of Jake standing near the now-removed Elite Anglers Club banner. By nightfall, Jake's phone was lighting up. Neighbors, journalists, one of the investors, wanting clarification. Even a county commissioner's office, asking for a meeting. But perhaps most satisfying of all, an email forwarded to him by a sympathetic resident from within Maple Creek Estates. It was an internal HOA message. From Wilkins, panicked, subject line, urgent damage control meeting. Required body. We must prepare immediate documentation for HOA oversight and potential media inquiries. Limit all external communication until we confirm narrative. Do not speak to press. Jake stared at the screen, slowly lowering the phone, letting the victory land like a quiet weight in his chest. They were losing control for the first time in years, maybe decades. The HOA was on the defensive. He stood on his deck that night, watching the moon ripple across the lake's surface. No boats, no banners, just peace. Emma joined him, 2 beers in hand. "You know," she said, handing him one, "you didn't just protect this place. You exposed something bigger." Jake took a sip and nodded. "I didn't come here to fight. I came here to rest." She smirked. Too late for that. They stood there for a long while, shoulder to shoulder. The cabin behind them glowing warm, the water before them shimmering soft and untouched. And somewhere in the distance, just barely on the wind, Jake thought he heard his grandfather's voice again. "You did good. Kid, you remembered the water." And for the first time in months, Jake Sullivan smiled, not with bitterness, not with tension, but with the quiet relief of a man who had chosen the harder path and found something better waiting at the end of it. The storm didn't arrive with sirens or crashing thunder. It came quietly, 2 days after Sarah Lynn's article ran online. The full print edition hit doorsteps across Red Valley and every mailbox in Maple Creek Estates. The headline was impossible to miss. Evicted Lake. Public lies, HOA accused of trespassing and misuse of funds. Below it was a full-color photo of Jake standing on his dock, arms folded, the early morning mist curling behind him. He hadn't realized she'd taken it. He looked calm, grounded, but his eyes told the real story. The story went viral within 24 hours. Local news stations picked it up. A regional legal podcast featured it. Facebook exploded. Comment sections flooded with support, outrage, confusion. Residents from across the state chimed in with their own HOA horror stories. Jake's inbox filled with messages from people he didn't know. Landowners, lawyers, retired city officials. many of them thanking him for standing up to what they called the silent tyranny of homeowner associations. But amid the support, another current churned beneath the surface: panic. Emma had predicted it. They'll try to flip the narrative. She told Jake over coffee that morning, paint you as the aggressor, the outsider. If they can't win the facts, they'll try to win the story. She wasn't wrong. By noon, the Maple Creek Estates HOA issued a public response, a carefully worded letter posted to their website and sent via email to all residents. It was titled, "Clarifying the Sullivan Lake Situation." It read, "In part, we are saddened by the misinformation being circulated about our long-standing stewardship of the lake area, which has always been guided by community interest and historical collaboration. While certain technical aspects of ownership are under legal review, we urge our residents to remain calm and support the HOA as we seek clarity during this temporary uncertainty." Jake read it 3 times, each time with growing disbelief. "They just gaslit the entire neighborhood," he said, slamming the laptop shut. Emma sighed. "It's what they do, but it's also a sign they're on the ropes. They wouldn't be this careful if they weren't scared." He leaned against the counter, jaw clenched. "They're still hoping people don't read the details. They're trying to buy time, delay action, let things cool off." Emma nodded. "Then we won't let it cool down." She spent the next hours drafting formal letters to the HOA board, to the County Ethics Commission, and to the State Attorney General's office. Every document was clear, detailed, backed by evidence, and laced with just enough legal consequence to make even the most stubborn bureaucrat take notice. And then something happened that neither Jake nor Emma expected. Residents began showing up. It started with a knock, gentle, hesitant. Jake opened the door to find an older woman standing there, wringing her hands. Her name was Linda. She'd lived in Maple Creek for 12 years. "I just wanted to say," she began softly, "I had no idea about the lake, about any of it." Jake stepped aside, welcomed her in. They sat at the table while she sipped tea and flipped through the binder Emma had created, the one with the deeds, the old photos, the legal filings. Her eyes welled up when she saw the image of Jake's grandfather helping a group of local kids fish from the dock in 1974. "My grandson learned to fish right here last summer," she whispered. "I thought it was public land." Jake's voice was gentle. "You're not the enemy, Linda. They lied to everyone." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'd like to help, however I can." She wasn't the last. The next day, 2 more couples arrived. A week later, Jake hosted an informal gathering on his deck, half town hall, half therapy session, chairs circled around a folding table, pitchers of lemonade and stacks of documents at the center. Emma presented the facts, calmly and clearly, while Jake answered questions, never once raising his voice. And then came the turning point. A man named Michael Davis stood to speak, retired judge, widowed, moved into Maple Creek 2 years ago for the quiet life. "I've sat on enough benches to know fraud when I see it," he said slowly. "What the HOA has done here isn't just dishonest, it's dangerous. If they can take this lake, what's next? Your gardens? Your fences? Your homes?" A ripple went through the crowd. Heads nodded. Jake looked at him. "What do you suggest?" Michael didn't blink. "We vote. Emergency session. We remove the board." That night, Jake and Emma drafted a petition for immediate recall of the Maple Creek HOA board, citing gross misrepresentation, misuse of funds, and violation of ethical standards. Within 72 hours, they had over 80 signatures, more than enough under HOA bylaws to trigger a vote. Wilkins didn't go quietly. He called an emergency board meeting, attempting to frame the movement as a coordinated campaign of misinformation, led by a private landowner with unknown motives. But the damage had been done. Residents demanded transparency, and when Wilkins refused to present financial records, the crowd erupted. Jake didn't have to speak. Linda did. Michael did. Even Rye, cane in hand, stood and shouted, "We've had enough of the lies." The final vote, the result was decisive. Wilkins and 2 other board members were removed. Karen Mitchell, the vice president, resigned before she could be forced out. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the lake shimmered in fading gold, Michael Davis approached Jake on the dock. "I'd like to serve as interim chair," he said, "until we can hold proper elections." Jake nodded. "You've got my vote." A week later, the Maple Creek HOA board officially reversed its claim over Sullivan Lake, issuing a public apology and refunding portions of misallocated dues. The county opened an audit. Wilkins was subpoenaed. And Sarah Lynn's second article, The Reckoning of Maple Creek, How a Quiet Lake Changed Everything, was picked up by a national syndicate. But Jake wasn't celebrating. Not yet, because even as the lawsuits began and the systems unraveled, he realized something deeper had taken root, something more powerful than revenge or victory: community, real community. People began showing up not as invaders, but as neighbors. They asked permission. They offered help. They brought food, volunteered for cleanup, planted flowers along the trail that wrapped around the lake's southern edge. Jake began drafting a new plan, not to close the lake off forever, but to protect it the right way. He and Emma worked with Judge Davis and the County Environmental Council to form the Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, a nonprofit that would maintain the integrity of the lake while allowing limited, respectful community access through seasonal permits. It wasn't about fences anymore. It was about stewardship. It was about turning theft into transformation. One afternoon, Jake walked to the edge of the dock and ran his fingers along the bow of his grandfather's old boat, the same boat they'd tried to impound. It still bore the marks of time scratches, dings, faded paint, but it was back, floating steady, whole. He stepped inside, pushed off gently, and drifted toward the center of the lake. The water welcomed him. The trees stood tall and silent, guardians of something older than bylaws and borders. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because the land knew and so did he. Spring faded gently into early summer, and with it came a shift that Jake could feel not just in the weather, but in the air around Sullivan Lake. The tension that had hung over the water for weeks was gone now, dissipated like morning fog. In its place was a kind of cautious harmony, a shared understanding between a community that had nearly lost something precious and the man who had fought to protect it. But peace, Jake had learned, didn't just arrive. It had to be built, one conversation at a time. The newly formed Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, SLCT for short, was more than just a legal buffer. It was a statement. Emma helped him set up the nonprofit structure, working late nights from the cabin's dining table. They built a mission that honored his grandfather's values: preservation, education, and limited public use rooted in mutual respect. Within a month of the board turnover, the trust signed a formal agreement with the new HOA leadership, led by Judge Michael Davis. The document made clear that the lake and the 15-foot shoreline buffer remained Jake's private property, but would now be cooperatively maintained with the community on his terms. In exchange, residents could apply for seasonal passes to fish, kayak, walk the trails, with small permit fees going directly into the lake's maintenance fund. It was radical. In a quiet sort of way, a move from control to collaboration, and people responded. They started showing up not with demands, but with tools: hammers, rakes, trash bags. One Saturday, 10 volunteers helped Jake and Rye rebuild the old trail dock that had collapsed in the storm 2 winters ago. Teenagers carried planks. Retirees swept pine needles. A man who had once stood silently at the back of the HOA meeting offered to install a new solar light near the trailhead. Free of charge. Jake was skeptical at first. Years in Silicon Valley had taught him that altruism often came with strings. But here, it felt different. Here, people seemed to want healing just as much as he did. One morning, as he walked the east shoreline, the very same stretch where the elite anglers had hosted their tournaments, Jake noticed something new. A wooden bench had been installed beneath a pair of cottonwoods. No plaque, no fanfare, just a simple seat facing the water. He sat for a long time. When he got back to the cabin, a note was pinned to his door. For anyone who needs to remember what peace feels like. Oh, he didn't need to guess. Linda had become a kind of unofficial voice of the lake's rebirth. She'd organized 2 community gatherings, a children's cleanup day, and was now talking about starting a lake memory journal to collect stories from families who had visited over the years. She told Jake, half jokingly, that he should run for city council. He laughed, but part of him wondered, maybe the man he had become wasn't just a recluse by a lake. Maybe he had something more to offer, not in politics but in presence. Not everyone embraced the change. Gerald Thompson, once the self-proclaimed president of the elite anglers club, vanished almost entirely. After the story broke and the investors pulled out, he sold his house and left town without a word. No farewell, no fight, just one more man who thought ownership came with entitlement, only to realize too late that respect was the true currency. Jake didn't miss him. Richard Wilkins, on the other hand, was harder to forget. The county's investigation into the HOA's financials uncovered more than just misallocated funds. Emails recovered from Karen Mitchell's work account, Jess, the same Karen who had played the loyal lieutenant for years, showed Wilkins had knowingly withheld ownership documents during investment pitches. They had even drawn up a fake community management agreement for Sullivan Lake, signed only by HOA board members, but presented to investors as proof of control, forgery, fraud. A web of lies with just enough polish to fool the right people until it didn't. The county filed charges. Wilkins's real name, Richard Williams, surfaced in the news, linked to an old fraud case in Florida. Turns out, he had been banned from practicing real estate there. A development scheme collapsed under similar false claims. He had simply changed coasts, changed his last name, and started over. Jake read that article on the same porch where the saga began, coffee steaming in his hand. He felt no joy, no triumph, just completion. Emma, ever the pragmatist, came out and sat beside him. He'll probably plea out, she said. Avoid prison, but lose his licenses. Might have to pay restitution. Jake nodded. That's not the part I care about. She studied him. Then what do you care about? He looked out over the water. The loons were nesting again. He could see one dipping under, emerging moments later a few feet away with a flash of silver in its beak. I care that it's safe now, that it won't happen again. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. You did that. Jake shook his head. We did. All of us? A few days later, he held a small dedication at the new park on the eastern shore, right where the resort was once planned to rise. About 40 people came, families, retirees, kids. Emma wore a sundress and stood quietly beside a man from the county conservation office. Judge Davis brought a hand-carved wooden sign to install near the dock. Jake stepped up last. He didn't use a microphone, didn't need to. He stood under a broad oak, held a framed photo of his grandfather high, and said, "This lake wasn't built to be sold. It was built to be loved. My grandfather believed in teaching people how to respect nature, not profit from it. So if you come here, fish, paddle, sit in silence. Just remember, you're part of that promise now." He paused, looked around, then added quietly, "And I think he'd be proud of us." They unveiled the plaque together, a simple metal plate fastened to a large stone near the water, in honor of Arthur Sullivan, steward of the lake. Water is life. Take care of it, and it will take care of you. That night, Jake took the old boat out one more time. The stars were bright, the air cool, the lake still. He let the boat drift to the center, then dropped anchor and leaned back, staring up at the skies. There was no fight left, no war to wage, just the gentle lapping of water against aluminum and the hum of cicadas in the trees. He thought of everything that had happened, how close he'd come to losing everything, how easily a silence had been mistaken for surrender. But silence wasn't weakness. Sometimes, silence was strength, waiting for the right moment to speak. Jake closed his eyes and smiled. The lake would outlive them all. But now, it would do so on its own terms, and with the memory of those who fought to keep it whole still echoing through the trees in the weeks that followed the dedication ceremony. Life at Sullivan Lake began to settle into a new rhythm, one marked not by tension or conflict, but by something softer, something Jake hadn't fully allowed himself to believe in until then: belonging. It came in small moments. The boy who waved shyly as he passed the trailhead with his father, fishing poles bouncing against their shoulders, the teenage girl who painted a watercolor of the lake and left it on Jake's porch with a note that read, "Your fight helped me feel safe walking here again." The neighbor who knocked one morning just to say thank you and brought a pie still warm from the oven. Jake had never thought of himself as a symbol. He didn't want to be. But it was clear now his quiet resistance had done more than protect a boundary line. It had sparked something, a reminder. Maybe that power doesn't always wear a badge or hold a title. Sometimes power comes from standing still when the world tries to push you aside. Emma called it legacy maintenance. Jake called it showing up. The Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, once just an idea sketched on a napkin, had become a functioning entity. Monthly board meetings were held in the cabin's renovated side room, with Judge Davis acting as chair and Emma as legal advisor. Jake refused any formal title, but his presence was constant. He helped write guidelines for sustainable fishing, oversaw the installation of a new composting toilet near the East Trail, and even hosted a lake day where kids learned about freshwater ecology from a visiting biologist. The shoreline, once marred by illegal docks and careless footprints, began to heal. Wildflowers bloomed again along the edges. Birds nested without fear. The water, Jake swore, seemed clearer. One morning, Rye showed up with 2 cups of coffee and a smirk. "You see the Gazette?" he asked. Handing over the paper, Jake unfolded it. The headline read, "Former HOA President Richard Wilkins sentenced to community service after plea deal." Underneath, a small photo of Wilkins' suit wrinkled, hair grayer than before, eyes hollow. The article detailed his guilty plea to charges of misrepresentation and forgery, as well as his agreement to repay misused funds. No jail time, but a permanent ban from serving on any housing board in the state. He was also ordered to perform 500 hours of service at an environmental nonprofit. Fitting, Rye muttered, sipping. Maybe he'll learn the difference between control and care. Jake folded the paper, set it on the porch railing, and said, "I don't hate him." Rye raised an eyebrow. "I mean it." Jake said, he was wrong. He did damage, but somewhere along the way, he probably started thinking he was the good guy, that he was protecting something. That's what makes people dangerous. Not evil, conviction. Rye stared at him for a long beat, then nodded. "That's the thing about places like this. They make you face yourself." Jake smiled faintly. "Or find yourself again." Later that week, Emma packed up her car to return to the city. She'd stayed longer than planned, almost 2 months, but Jake never once felt her presence as intrusive. In fact, her leaving now felt hollow. They stood by her car in the gravel driveway, suitcases loaded, morning sun filtering through the pines. "You sure you don't want to stay another week?" Jake asked, half joking. Emma chuckled. "You just want someone around to scare off any new HOA conspiracies." He shrugged. "You're good at it." She hesitated. "You know, I've been thinking about moving. Not here, necessarily, but closer, less courtroom, more conservation." Jake tilted his head. "That's a big change." "Yeah," she said, eyes flicking toward the lake. "But it feels like the world's trying to tell me something. That fighting to protect something you believe in is only part of the work. The other part is making space for what comes after." Jake nodded. "Peace is its own kind of activism." She smiled. "You're getting good at this poetic wisdom thing." He looked at her. "You gave me the language for it." She opened the car door, then paused. "Don't forget to repaint the boat." "I won't. And maybe take a break from being the lake's lone ranger." He laughed. "Only if you promise to come back." Emma leaned in, hugged him tight. "You won't even have to ask." After she drove off, the silence felt different, not empty, but full of possibility. Jake walked down to the dock, sat at the edge, and watched a dragonfly land on the tip of his boot. The lake stretched wide before him, unhurried, timeless. He thought of his grandfather then, not just the stories or the wisdom or the grit, but the faith. Arthur Sullivan had believed, deeply, in the idea that land could be both private and shared, that ownership didn't mean isolation, and that stewardship was a responsibility, not a right. Jake stood up, walked back to the cabin, and pulled out an old tackle box from the storage closet. At the bottom, beneath rusted hooks and weather-worn lures, was a faded photo his grandfather in the boat, holding up a massive bass, the lake behind him gleaming in the afternoon light. He framed it and hung it above the fireplace. 2 days later, the final transformation of the east shoreline was complete. What was once the staging ground for stolen tournaments and false claims was now a modest public park, with benches, shaded trails, a canoe rack, and a small wooden sign at the entrance: Sullivan Lake Conservation Area, private land, shared legacy, respect the water, respect each other. That weekend, the reformed local anglers group, now simply called Sullivan Lake Anglers, hosted its first permitted, environmentally compliant fishing event. No big prizes, no sponsors, just neighbors, casting lines and swapping stories. Jake watched from the deck as a boy, maybe 9 or 10, reeled in his first catch. His father clapped. The boy looked toward the cabin and smiled. Jake raised his hand in a slow wave. Later that night, he took the boat out again. The same boat, still rustic, still scarred by time and memory, but floating, capable, true. He paddled slowly to the lake's center, the moon reflecting off the water like shattered glass. He set the oars aside and leaned back, eyes tracing constellations. Sometimes, the world tries to convince you that power is loud, that it comes from position or force or fear. But Jake knew better now. Power was quiet. Power was protecting something when no one else saw the danger. Power was saying no and meaning it. Even when you stood alone, power was restoring what others tried to erase, not just physically, but morally. And peace was not the absence of struggle. It was the presence of meaning after the fight was over. The lake was healthier now than it had been in decades. Clearer water, more fish, cleaner banks. Even the loons had returned in greater numbers. Jake closed his eyes. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't about defending what's yours. It's about inviting others to see its worth and protecting it together. As he drifted gently in the dark, with the whisper of water around him and the stars standing silent guard above, Jake Sullivan let out a breath he hadn't known he was still holding. And finally, he let go not of the past, but of the fear that the past could be lost again. The lake was still his, but now it belonged to more than him. It belonged to everyone who chose to respect it. And that, he realized, was the truest kind of ownership there is.